Hi, everybody. Bojo. My name is Sage Patanicus, and I will be delivering the um, grounding and appropriation modules for the VADA program. I just wanted to start with my traditional introduction, and then I'll be translating it for you just afterwards. So Bojo, Mushkode, Bijike Washkwe, Indigenous cause, Moskon Sendodem, a technique Shing and Donjaba, Abiding with de Queen Dao, Ojibwe, what they want me, Nishnabe Queen Dao. So, what I delivered was a traditional Ojibwe introduction, and I did that in my traditional language, Ojibwe. So what I talked about first was my spirit name. And so that is Mushkode Bijike Washkwe. And so what that translates to is Buffalo Sage Woman. And the second thing I talked about was my clan. And in my culture, that's how we traditionally organize our system of government. Also, like our society is just organized by clans. So I'm Elk Clan, and that clan is responsible for the social well-being of the people, and we're also known as like pacifists and peacekeepers. We're pretty good at mediation. And then the last couple things I talked about, the first was my nation. So I come from Atikamek-Shing and Anishinaabeg, so that's the First Nation that I live on. It's up by Sudbury, Ontario. The building behind me, as you can see, it's in a dome shape, lodge shape. It's on our powwow grounds, at our sacred grounds on my reserve. I come from the Ojibwe, Potawatomi nations, and those are two different kind of nations. So Ojibwe and Potawatomi, they're in like a confederacy type of group. So these are confederacies that predate contact with the any of the European nations. Professionally, I am a filmmaker and multimedia artist and a writer. And so these are things that I've been trained in through school. So I'm also a Humber grad. I graduated from the Film and Television Production program, as well as the Media Foundation program through the FMCA. And that's how I actually met Anne. She was one of my Media Foundation teachers, professors. And so that's how I got involved. I also am the creative producer of the Indigenous Transmedia Fellowship. That is through the Center for Creative Business Innovation at the at Humber College. So the other thing that I am trained in is traditional craft making. So I make moccasins and mucklucks and beadwork, regalia, which is just like traditional outfits for like our nations, our indigenous nations. I also am trained in teaching those, so I can deliver courses and workshops so that other Anishinaabe people can make those as well. So today we're going to be talking about grounding ourselves and situating ourselves. So this module is supposed to be delivered into two separate, I guess, classes. So in the first week, I'll just be talking about that. For this beginner portion, we're going to be talking about grounding ourselves. And so, what that has to do with appropriation. Um, first, in order to talk about appropriation, though, it's definitely important to understand who you are. And for some people, that's a lot easier. We get that through our culture, we get that through like our parents, or we develop it over time, like just spending time with yourself and understanding yourself. But in terms of like who we are and our identity, that's a really important discussion about appropriation. So this conversation about grounding ourselves, from my perspective as an Indigenous person, as an Ojibwe, an Anishinaabe person, this grounding yourself is about situating yourself. And what that means is understanding where you are in a given space and time. So right now, I can say like I'm in my house, I'm like living in Canada, I live close to Sudbury, Ontario, and I am a citizen of the world. So you kind of, what you can do is like start from where you are, and then you can like work back in the circles of like the social places you inhabit. But what that means for Indigenous people is like a lot, it can be a lot different. So what what I'd like to get you to consider is that there are different ways that different nations they interact with the world, and so that allows them to it allows them to walk through the world differently. I feel that culturally, like we are not all the same. Like we are um we come from different backgrounds and families, and so from my perspective, that what we how we introduce ourselves traditionally as an Anishinaabe, we're able to use that um throughout the different ways that we interact with the rest of the world. So we introduce ourselves like with our spirit names, and we have that relationship. So that's just so at the beginning of like any type of introduction, like with a new group of people, you're making it known like who you are. So just in terms of why introductions are important, is it allows you to connect yourself to other communities that you're a part of. In my case, like in my introduction, I was able to explain where I come from, like my family, any type of social circle I'm a part of. It also creates a certain level of accountability, which is really important, especially in the art and any type of industry you really work with, especially with Indigenous people specifically. They'll want to know like where you come from, who your family is. They want to know what your nation is. A lot of that has to do with respect specifically. When it comes to identity and grounding, it creates a level. It's kind of like creating a level playing field where you're at a level of understanding and respect, knowing where that other person is coming from. In terms of why accountability is important, later on when we talk about appropriation, that accountability, I would say it creates a clarity that doesn't allow people to hide behind um, anything, really. There's a truth and an honesty that comes with those kinds of introductions, especially when you're working with marginalized communities. It's really important to be transparent about who you are and where you're from. There is a long history of us being taken advantage of, and especially in the case of people not being truthful about where they are, where they come from. And that might be different culture to culture, especially in Canada, since we are very, this is a country that has a lot of different cultures. You're going to have different boundaries within whichever community you work with. And boundaries are important to respect because these communities that you may work with, they may not have um, the same standards that you do as someone who doesn't normally interact with those communities. So it's important to, in developing yourself as an artist, to always be honest about where you're coming from and to be forthright with who you are, because it creates a trust that can't be recreated, or it can't be falsified, or at least when it does get falsified, like, people are going to find out that you aren't being genuine. And this is not to say that none of you as growing artists like aren't genuine, but it's important for you to use your identity in a way that creates, or it it helps grow your integrity as an artist and as a person. So an important part of establishing your identity and grounding yourself is understanding like what spaces you inhabit. So not just like with people, but like physically the land. What kind of history is there with the land? And so I feel that, and a lot of Indigenous people feel this way, is that it's our responsibility as people to uphold the history of the land. And that can mean like positive things, like, oh, this is where like we always used to like pick berries, or like in terms of waterways, like this is the route that we took to like trade with the neighboring nations. It can also mean like terrible history, and that could be like the mush hole at the Six Nations Indian Reserve. And so what that's talking about is the residential school in Toronto. It's known as the carrying place, or Toronto, if you didn't know, comes from a Mohawk word, Tekaronto, and that is, I think it has to do with the fishing wharfs on the lakefront. Also, if you're familiar with the Toronto street names, the word Spadina comes from Ojibwe. It translates to Spadina, and what that means is like a high place. And so that, I think that's in relationship to the original shoreline that was Lake Ontario, which was, I think, along Davenport. If you've driven along Davenport, it has like a cliff. And along there, it kind of, like, our place names can have spiritual meanings, like physical meanings, and also just have meanings on like how we related to things. Like, it's like a literal translation. What's been like come to be expected out of like people interacting with lands that are stolen, or lands that were traditionally taken care of by like Indigenous people? What's come to be expected as land acknowledgements. And land acknowledgements, if you're unfamiliar with them, they have to do with typically before events, or college courses, or any type of gathering of people. What sometimes happens is organizations or people will take it upon themselves to deliver a land acknowledgement. So usually what they do is they acknowledge the traditional name of the place. They acknowledge the people that were there before them. And they also acknowledge sometimes they acknowledge any like ongoing forms of like colonialism or racism like that's still happening on the land. It does like pose a lot of questions like, okay, you're acknowledging that the land is there, or you're acknowledging that it was taken care of by like indigenous people, but the land isn't in like it's not like it's being given back. It's like, thanks for letting us use this. Anyways, like, let's get back to business. It's kind of like it's a forethought afterthought in a way. So if you ever like asked, like, if you ever met another indigenous person, you might come across some like mixed feelings. Like, a lot of people feel that it's important. Sometimes it's really funny because even though like you're acknowledging the land, like maybe you don't take the time to like say the names of the nations in the address like correctly, or it feels rushed, or it doesn't feel like any real relationships are being built like when you're doing them. Or like also there's kind of like an aftercare portion, like, yeah, we delivered that land acknowledgement, but what does that mean to our course or our program? And I feel that that's up to like we can't, as or me, I don't expect people to like have a desire to learn more about indigenous people based on a land acknowledgement, because I feel like sometimes the way it's being used is like a chore. And so I feel that we should hold ourselves to like a higher standard of like, well, we did this land acknowledgement, but what kind of learning afterwards are we doing? Are we learning about the treaties that like inhabit the land? What nations are they between? Or like, does that include me? There's oftentimes or I don't know if you've heard of this statement before, but specifically around Native land rights, people will say we are all treaty people. And so what that means is like anyone who comes to live in Canada, like because you're choosing to live in Canada, you should become aware of like what kind of treaties that Canada is a part of. Being informed is like one of the best things you can be. It's not like some random Native person is going to come up to you on the street and say like, what treaties here? Like, we're not going to like quiz you like that, right? But it is important to us that at least the newer generations, or the people who are willing to work with us, or like the people who call themselves kind Canadians, are actually like also well informed, or they're also respectful Canadians. So from an Indigenous perspective, the topic of identity and grounding yourself is highly important. I spoke before a bit about the accountability aspect and like the respect and trust that comes with having an identity, but there is also a huge importance on it, simply because identity was something that was meant to be stripped away from us. And this is through the systemic processes that were put in place by Canada. And before that, the Crown. This was through missionary work. It was through literal genocide, like warring, biological warfare, and also things like the residential school system, the 60s scoop, and even today, like ongoing um, uh, social issues such as the child welfare system, mainstream education, any efforts that don't include the revitalization of Indigenous identities, such as the things that we take our pride in, like things that make a culture, such as um, the language, the food, the people themselves, what keeps a nation going, the children, the youth, the future, and anything that would encompass things that have to do with the culture are things that Indigenous people have had deliberately taken away from them. In some cases, some nations, like, they'll never be able to like eat from the lakes that they regularly fish from, or the rivers. Um, they can't go to the regular hunting grounds, or their reserve is like really far away from where they would normally go hunting. Um, and that's just specifically food and like nature and land related. So identity is hugely important because we as Indigenous people have to constantly be working to reestablishing our connection to our culture and our connection to who we are. It's not something that generally comes easily because it's a lot easier, and it's actually what was intended from those genocidal efforts from the Canadian government and um, from the crown, was to assimilate us into mainstream culture. So that's a lot to like think about and a lot to deal with. But it's something that you can't really shy away from, especially if you want to be working with uh, communities who've been through any type of like historical trauma, any groups of people that typically get appropriated from. There's also a history of like those groups being exploited um through land resources as well as like their overall image. So moving into appropriation, I just want you to like think about like a historical scope of people that encompasses like their history with anything to do with what I talked about, like their history with um land resource extraction, or their history with being losing their language through residential schools, or losing like entire um, government systems because our communities had like our governments overthrown and imposed from like the Canadian government and Indian agents. So that encompass that into your thought moving forward in thinking about appropriation and how it actually connects to the exploitation of our imagery, like as Indigenous people, how our exploitation of a people through media and music and design, anything art related, it also connects to our history of having our images or our cultures, our music, like taken away from us. That is a serious conversation for the next module, is just getting you to think about how the whole of what you need to consider um in the respect to appreciation, and representation is just understanding what had to get erased from us in order for anything media related, or like what is seen today about like Indigenous people, what is shown, like what you actually see. So that's just a long way of saying that I don't want I don't want it to be forgotten that what had to be lost in order for us to like still be surviving, or still be like still looking for people to like be respectful of our people, and that we are still capable of representing ourselves and of standing up for like who we are, despite all those things that have happened to us. And so there's a lot that I feel that I have to celebrate as an Indigenous person. And Indigenous is such a broad way to say it, but how I feel as Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Bodewonmi, and like I'm able to celebrate that. I do have my Anishinaabe name. I do have like my spirit name. I do have a clan. I do have knowledge about like our medicines and our old forms of like Indigenous knowledge. And it's it and part of my work like as an artist in like media has been to like help promote like the reemergence of Indigenous people like in our culture, and like how we in a contemporary setting like are able to like keep going, and like we have our own things to worry about. We have like a lot to do to rebuild and like undo the damage that has been done to our people. So I do have an exercise for you guys to try by yourselves or as a group. I'm not sure how the class is organized. It's an exercise in self-reflection, in grounding yourself and situating yourself. So just in the fashion that I shared with you guys on sharing about like my name, my clan, my community, and my culture, I'd like you to reflect on that as well. But I'd also like you to start by first answering those questions of like your name. I'd like you to talk about your family. So that can be like any type of kinship you have, like it could be any type of communities that you inhabit. And I'd like you to talk about where you come from, or what is your community. And after that, you can go into what is your culture. So that can have hugely a lot to do with where you come from. Or sometimes it doesn't. Maybe your family or like your lineage has a history of like migration. You can talk about that. And from there, I'd like you to also reflect on your relationship to the land. A lot of identity, interestingly enough, it has to do with yourself, but it also has to do with your relationship to other beings, whether that be with the natural world, with your familial world, or even the laws of the land that exist on top of the natural law, or the spiritual laws that exist. So what, in your case, like, you can answer where I am right now, are there any treaties that exist? Where I am right now, like, am I obligated to like follow those? And like, actually you are. If you chose to live in a certain area, they're governed by not just like Canadian law, but they're also governed by indigenous laws. And so that specifically meaning before there was Canadian law, before there was a crown law, there was a way in which the indigenous people of that specific part, they were governed themselves, or we had come up with specific treaties between nations, or between like that nation and the land, with how to act appropriately or act accordingly, so that everyone could prosper, everyone could have enough. And it was a place that all the people could thrive. So that's just something to think of until next week. And upon that, we will be talking about appropriation. I will be getting more into representation talk and what it has to do with what we talked about this week. I did a little bit talk about appropriation. And yeah, I have a nice little list here. And that will also be pre-recorded. So look forward to seeing you all online. And I hope you have a very good rest of your program. So bye.